Good morning. We have come to the end of the month of September, and this is the beginning of the fall and winter recordings. In a sane world, I think I would be discussing the Ukraine situation, which historically will prove, I think, very important both for the future of Europe and the United States. And in a sane world, one might also discuss the foreign policy potentials of our two presidential candidates. But we live in an insane world, and so I'm going to talk about the Middle East. Now, I'm assuming you've all been listening to some extent to the news and the events and so forth, so I won't rehearse them. So allow me to spend this time or this session on kind of wild sort of speculation, and as the events of the Middle East are coming down hot and heavy. Each day there are new developments, and sometimes it's worth sitting back and saying, so what are the consequences of all? The consequences that are discussed on the news is, how many Hezbollah leaders have been killed? Is Israel today going to physically move into Lebanon? What about the West Bank that hardly gets mentioned, et cetera, et cetera? So rather than getting in the morass of all of that at the moment, let me just reflect about what has happened and what the future implications may be. Now, in the narrow sense, and of course, the future implications have to do with the state of Israel and the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, who at the moment seems to be riding high, right? He's gotten rid of a bunch of Hezbollah leadership. Gaza has essentially been destroyed. The West Bank is under horrendous stress. Several hundred Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been newly imprisoned since last October. It used to be that, teenagers, young adults, women were picked off the streets of Gaza and imprisoned without charging for a long period of time. And we've discussed this before. But added now, since the situation in Gaza has been that actually the Israelis are torturing the prisoners that are in from the West Bank. How do we know this? Well, through news reports, and the minister of the Israeli government in charge of the prison system has authorized torture. So that's moved on to into a new stage. The situation in Gaza that we've been keeping abreast of, and now, of course, there's the situation in Lebanon. Not only has the leadership of Hezbollah been decapitated, but as of today, Israel, both in terms of bombardments, but also in terms of probably physically moving into Lebanon, areas of Lebanon have been destroyed that were not Hezbollah. 1 million Lebanese have left their homes and are essentially living in the streets. And scores of Lebanese unrelated to Hezbollah have been killed in the process of apartment houses collapsing and so forth, where Hezbollah had its offices. So no matter what the exact outcome of the next few days, the small country of Lebanon, which once upon a time was a vacation place for Europeans on the Mediterranean, and just a beautiful small little country, which has, of course, over the years has had conflict. There was '06, where Israel moved in and occupied, and there have been internal conflicts. So to begin with, Lebanon is both a political and to some extent, not to some extent, an economic disaster area. Uh, but the Lebanese, unrelated to anything Hezbollah, are now also suffering. So, how do we think about this in the long term? In the most short term and the long term, it looks like, Netanyahu is taking active measures. He's destroying the enemies. Even, Yemen is being bombed, and the military hardware, etc., that Lebanon has, which of course comes from Iran, is being destroyed. So it really looks like, little Israel is both smart, well armed, and doing the job of sort of sweeping in the area of all the Shiite areas and Shiite groups, and essentially saying to Iran, who has armed Hezbollah and so forth, that you better not get involved directly. You better keep using the surrogates, because otherwise, we might have a nuclear conflict, which of course still is possible. So then one thinks, let's say Israel's aims in Lebanon get realized. It has already managed to destroy Gaza. The situation in the West Bank is one in which one can hardly imagine that a two-state solution is going to be possible. That is a real Israeli victory, because Netanyahu doesn't want a two-state solution. Many Israelis have supported it, but Netanyahu, and certainly the right wing in Israel, is not interested in a two-state solution. And the situation in Gaza and in the West Bank are such at this point, based on the destruction that has taken place so far, that it is very unlikely that in any near future a two-state solution can even be created out of this mess. So those who thought that the long-term solution for Israel would be a two-state solution and figuring out how to live more peacefully with the Palestinians, that seems to have, evaporated into thin air, other than at some kind of rhetorical level of those who still think some kind of peace is possible. But I'm also interested in a much different and longer term. Supposing Israel achieves what it sought to achieve with certainly the current government, that is to say, Gaza is a monumental mess, and Israel will find it not so difficult to occupy. The West Bank increasingly is under worse and worse distress, and it doesn't look like there are any groups in the West Bank who can get their act together to argue effectively for the viability of a independent West Bank Palestinian state. So what we have, on the one hand, is a lot of destruction, and destruction which sort of seems satisfactory if you see that the enemy and the enemy territories that have been bugging Israel and have made Israel unsafe and led to the hostage taking and led to the evacuation of Israelis along the northern border because Hezbollah was sending missiles across the way. It looks like a potential success story. And I would like to argue that in the long term, this is a monumental failure. Can you imagine being a Ghazian? Or can you imagine being a Lebanese, whether supportive of Hezbollah or not? Can you imagine being a person living in the West Bank and not remembering what has happened during the last year, and not having at least young folks decide that something needs to be done about the state of Israel? That is to say, Israel might have bought itself some period of control in the area. But in the human and psychological aspect, it is hard to imagine that even Gazans who were anti-Hamas have anything but the greatest hostility towards Israel coming out of this. And so what Israel has bought itself, it seems to me, is some military control and demonstrating that Israel, is far more powerful than any group or subgroups, and that if Israel gets its mind to it, it can, create a desert out of Gaza and it completely destabilize any prospects for Palestinian state in the West Bank and create a total mess in Lebanon, which will make it really difficult to create a stable state in Lebanon. From that perspective, Israel can say they have succeeded down the line somewhere. But from the perspective of the future of Israel in the Middle East, it is hard to imagine that the youth of all those countries, knowing what has happened to their families, the deaths, the maiming, the loss of eyes, for example, on the part of so many children after the walkie-talkies and all those things were blown up. I mean, if you look at it in the short term, you say how miraculous that Israel had this plan of putting little electric devices made in one place, assembled in another, but all done under Israeli auspices and then sold to Hamas from third and fourth parties. Isn't it remarkable and creative on the part of the Israeli government to have done that? But look at what's happened. It hasn't just killed the leadership. It has injured, maimed, and killed small armies of innocent teenagers and children. If you look at the physical consequences for the children of Gaza, if you look at the psychological consequences of every individual young person in Gaza, in the West Bank, now in Lebanon, it is difficult to imagine that those folks will someday put support and put their shoulder to the wheel to develop nice democratic and peaceful relationship with the state of Israel. So sort of both philosophically and in historical terms, what looks like considerable Israeli success in terms of its aims of getting rid of these hostile groups and preventing a two-state solution in certainly the near and mid terms sounds like both prescient on the part of the current Israeli government and showing the might and the capability of Israel. And from that perspective, I think Israel has gained in prestige, in self-identity, in even supporting the current government, which many Israelis had not been supporting. And yet, if you look at the medium and long term, it seems to me this is a permanent disaster for the state of Israel. And it is not just a permanent disaster for the state of Israel, it is a permanent disaster for the people of Gaza, for the people of the West Bank, and for that matter, both the pro-Hezbollah and the non-Hezbollah Lebanese. So it is a tragedy that on the news sometimes sounds like, oh, well, a few thousand people there gotten killed or maimed or hospitalized or whatever. And of course, these are the prices of war. But if one looks at other wars, if one looks at World War II, if one looks at Afghanistan, if one looks at some aspects of the war in Iraq, the psychological and social harm that these conflicts visit upon the populations, which are considered collateral damage, are such that it is difficult to imagine that peaceful, pleasant, democratic societies will emerge, and that the humans both physical harm to the humans and the psychological harm to humans, and a generation of children will not lead to more and more disasters. In other words, what I'm arguing is that the tragedy of all of this is not just the people who get killed, but the tragedy is of what remains for humans to contend with in the future. And we know from the past and from the studies of the psychological impact on warfare, on children and young adults, not to mention adults, that this actually does not lead to pleasant, democratic, peaceful societies. So while one in some ways looks at the current activities on an hour-to-hour basis, and if one, is happy with the state of Israel conquering all its enemies, I think the situation in the short term may look much better than it's going to look in the new term. And I think historians will have to point to this period as saying this is a massive tragedy for the region. Now, before I end, let me also say, of course, that the US is very much implicated in all of this, because after all, the arms that are being used, the budgetary support directly and indirectly to the state of Israel comes from us in the United States. The largest military aid over decades now from the US has gone to Israel. And the support that Israel has received, both in hardware and in financial support and in technological support, has continued throughout this past year. And if you read today's newspapers, X billion more dollars have been allocated for Israel for the future. So we in the United States are in fact funding much of what is causing the damage in that part of the world. Now, it's admittedly, of course, Iran is funding the Houthis and the Shiite groups and so forth. But let's just examine ourselves for a moment. It is de rigueur in the United States to say we will do anything to protect the state of Israel. And in that sense, we certainly have helped Israel succeed. But if one is interested in the long term for the state of Israel and believes that the state of Israel could have become a role model, a democratic role model in the region, could have had a positive influence, and in any event provide a peaceful and very democratic society for its own population, I'm afraid that there is a lot of erosion with respect to that as well. So while all candidates and legislators and so forth keep saying we have to support the state of Israel, and I'm not arguing that the state of Israel should not be supported, but the kind of support we've been giving the state of Israel certainly has had an impact. And if you are sitting in the Middle East, you would say to yourself, on the one hand, a plague on Israel for having done to our societies what they've done, and then a plague to the United States who are complicit in all of this. Again, yes, bad things have happened to Israel. Yes, the hostages were taken. But even that is a complex story because the hostage taking was in many ways the failure of the Netanyahu government. And furthermore, even the arming of Hamas in Gaza was to some extent funded by Israel, indirectly the US, which gave funds to Qatar, which in turn helped Hamas and so forth. So America's role in all of this and its complicity in the consequences of all of this needs to be discussed, I think, in our society. I think it's something we need to think about. I think that the role we imagine we play, this positive democratic role in the world, and the world, and many countries in the world, can be forgiven for thinking of us in very different ways. So while in some senses the state of Israel has succeeded in its short-term military and maybe even medium-term goals of dealing with the jihadist groups that are surrounding it, my suggestion is that in the future there will be ever more jihadist groups with ever more people of younger generations uh, having suffered through all of this and having been psychologically harmed through all of this, taking it into their own hands to continue to make life miserable. And since the state of Israel, had a good reason to be founded, and we had every reason to, be happy about a democratic, reasonable state in the Middle East, I think that the image that history will give all of this will be a lot less favorable. And that is tragic, I think, for Israel as a state, for the people of Israel, for, anti-Semitism piping up here, then in yonder. And it is also, I think, a tragedy for the US because whether we like it or not, our influence in the world has been eroding over some period of time, as certainly as a role model in many ways. And I think our influence will be reduced rather than enhanced by the relative success of Israel of wiping out its opposition to the left, to the right, and to the center. I think it's a very sad situation in the Middle East in many ways, but I think the long-term, middle-term, and long-term implications of this have not really been discussed enough, and I hope that there will be more discussions of this and that we can figure out some way not to remedy the situation, but to kind of address the situation, which at the end of the day is utter misery in a large part of the world, even if justified by the state of Israel for having been surrounded by enemies. My bottom line is the enemies may all be destroyed at the moment, but the enemies will reemerge, and if anything, with probably greater strength. And that, I think, is a very sad outcome in terms of what's happening. Thank you very much for listening.